Supermind and the life divine. A divine life upon earth, the ideal we have placed before us, can only come about by a spiritual change of our being and a radical and fundamental change, an evolution or revolution of our nature. The embodied being upon earth would have to rise out of the domination over it of its veils of mind, life and body into the full consciousness and possession of its spiritual reality, and its nature also would have to be lifted out of the consciousness and power of consciousness proper to a mental, vital and physical being into the greater consciousness and greater power of being and the larger and freer life of the spirit. It would not lose these former veils, but they would no longer be veils or imperfect expressions but true manifestations. They would be changed into states of light, powers of spiritual life, vehicles of a spiritual existence. But this again could not be if mind, life and body were not taken up and transformed by a state of being and a force of being superior to them, a power of supermind as much above our incomplete mental nature as that is above the nature of animal life and animated matter, as it is immeasurably above the mere material nature. The supermind is in its very essence a truth consciousness, a consciousness always free from the ignorance which is the foundation of our present natural or evolutionary existence, and from which nature in us is trying to arrive at self-knowledge and world knowledge and a right consciousness and the right use of our existence in the universe. The supermind, because it is a truth consciousness, has this knowledge inherent in it and this power of true existence. Its course is straight and can go direct to its aim. Its field is wide and can even be made illimitable. This is because its very nature is knowledge. It has not to acquire knowledge but possesses it in its own right. Its steps are not from nescience or ignorance into some imperfect light, but from truth to greater truth, from right perception to deeper perception, from intuition to intuition, from illumination to utter and boundless luminousness, from growing widenesses to the utter vasts and to very infinitude. On its summits it possesses the divine omniscience and omnipotence, but even in an evolutionary movement of its own graded self-manifestation by which it would eventually reveal its own highest heights, it must be in its very nature essentially free from ignorance and error. It starts from truth and light and moves always in truth and light. As its knowledge is always true, so too its will is always true. It does not fumble in its handling of things or stumble in its paces. In the supermind, feeling and emotion do not depart from their truth, make no slips or mistakes, do not swerve from the right and the real, cannot misuse beauty and delight or twist away from a divine rectitude. In the supermind, sense cannot mislead or deviate into the grossnesses which are here its natural imperfections and the cause of reproach, distrust and misuse by our ignorance. Even an incomplete statement made by the supermind is a truth leading to a further truth, its incomplete action a step towards completeness. All the life and action and leading of the supermind is guarded in its very nature from the falsehoods and uncertainties that are our lot. It moves in safety towards its perfection. Once the truth consciousness was established here on its own sure foundation, the evolution of divine life would be a progress in felicity, a march through light to Ananda. Supermind is an eternal reality of the divine being and the divine nature. In its own plane it already and always exists and possesses its own essential law of being. It has not to be created or to emerge or evolve into existence out of involution in matter or out of non-existence, as it might seem to the view of mind, which itself seems to its own view to have so emerged from life and matter or to have evolved out of an involution in life and matter. The nature of supermind is always the same, a being of knowledge, proceeding from truth to truth, creating or rather manifesting what has to be manifested by the power of a pre-existent knowledge, not by hazard but by a self-existent destiny in the being itself, a necessity of the thing in itself and therefore inevitable. Its manifestation of the divine life will also be inevitable. Its own life on its own plane is divine, and, if supermind descends upon the earth, it will bring necessarily the divine life with it and establish it here. Supermind is the grade of existence beyond mind, life and matter, and, as mind, life and matter have manifested on the earth, so too must supermind in the inevitable course of things manifest in this world of matter. In fact, a supermind is already here, but it is involved, concealed behind this manifest mind, life and matter, and not yet acting overtly or in its own power. If it acts, it is through these inferior powers and modified by their characters and so not yet recognizable. It is only by the approach and arrival of the descending supermind that it can be liberated upon earth and reveal itself in the action of our material, vital and mental parts, so that these lower powers can become portions of a total divinized activity of our whole being. It is that will bring to us a completely realized divinity or the divine life. It is indeed so that life and mind involved in matter have realized themselves here, for only what is involved can evolve, otherwise there could be no emergence. The manifestation of a supramental truth consciousness is therefore the capital reality that will make the divine life possible. It is when all the movements of thought, impulse and action are governed and directed by a self-existent and luminously automatic truth consciousness, and our whole nature comes to be constituted by it and made of its stuff, that the life divine will be complete and absolute. Even as it is, in reality, though not in the appearance of things, it is a secret self-existent knowledge and truth that is working to manifest itself in the creation here. The divine is already there, immanent within us. Ourselves are that in our inmost reality, and it is this reality that we have to manifest. It is that which constitutes the urge towards the divine living and makes necessary the creation of the life divine even in this material existence. A manifestation of the supermind in its truth consciousness is then inevitable. It must happen in this world sooner or later. But it has two aspects: a descent from above, an ascent from below, a self-revelation of the spirit, an evolution in nature. The ascent is necessarily an effort, a working of nature, an urge or nisus on her side to raise her lower parts by an evolutionary or revolutionary change, conversion or transformation into the divine reality, and it may happen by a process and progress or by a rapid miracle. The descent or self-revelation of the spirit is an act of the supreme reality from above which makes the realization possible, and it can appear either as the divine aid which brings about the fulfillment of the progress and process, or as the sanction of the miracle. Evolution, as we see it in this world, is a slow and difficult process and, indeed, needs usually ages to reach abiding results. But this is because it is in its nature an emergence from inconscient beginnings, a start from nescience, and a working in the ignorance of natural beings by what seems to be an unconscious force. There can be, on the contrary, an evolution in the light and no longer in the darkness, in which the evolving being is a conscious participant and co-operator, and this is precisely what must take place here. Even in the effort and progress from the ignorance to knowledge, this must be in part if not wholly the endeavor to be made on the heights of the nature, and it must be wholly that in the final movement towards the spiritual change, realization, transformation. It must be still more so when there is a transition across the dividing line between the ignorance and the knowledge, and the evolution is from knowledge to greater knowledge, from consciousness to greater consciousness, from being to greater being. There is then no longer any necessity for the slow pace of the ordinary evolution. There can be rapid conversion, quick transformation after transformation, what would seem to our normal present mind, a succession of miracles. An evolution on the supramental levels could well be of that nature. It could be equally, if the being so chose, a more leisurely passage of one supramental state or condition of things to something beyond but still supramental, from level to divine level, a building up of divine gradations, a free growth to the supreme supermind, or beyond it to yet undreamed levels of being, consciousness and ananda. The supramental knowledge, the truth consciousness of the supermind is in itself one and total, even when there is a voluntary limitation of the knowledge or what might seem to be a partial manifestation. It is so voluntarily. The limitation does not proceed from or result in any kind of ignorance. It is not a denial or withholding of knowledge, for all the rest of the truth that is not brought into expression is implicit there. Above all, there are no contradictions. Whatever would seem to be opposites to the mind, here carry in themselves their own right relation and reconciling agreement, if indeed any reconciliation were needed, for the harmony of these apparent opposites is complete. The mind tends to put the personal and the impersonal in face of each other as if they were two contraries, but the supermind sees and realizes them as, at the lowest, complements and mutually fulfilling powers of the single reality, and, more characteristically, as interfused and inseparable and themselves that single reality. The person has his aspect of impersonality inseparable from himself, without which he could not be what he is or could not be his whole self. the impersonal is in its truth not a state of existence, a state of consciousness and a state of bliss, but a being self-existent, conscious of self, full of his own self-existent bliss, bliss the very substance of his being, so, the one single and illimitable person, Purusha. In the supermind the finite does not cut up or limit the infinite, does not feel itself contrary to the infinite, but rather it feels its own infinity. The relative and temporal is not a contradiction of eternity but a right relation of its aspects, a native working or an imperishable feature of the eternal. Time there is only the eternal in extension and the eternal can be felt in the momentary. Thus the integral divine is there in the supermind and no theory of illusion or self-contradictory Maya need be thrust in to justify its way of existence. It will be obvious that an escape from life is not necessary for the divine to find itself or its reality. It possesses that always whether in cosmic life or in its transcendent existence. The divine life cannot be a contradiction of the divine or of the supreme reality. It is part of that reality, an aspect or expression of it, and it can be nothing else. In life on the supramental plane all the divine is possessed, and when the supermind descends on earth, it must bring the divine with it and make that full possession possible here. The divine life will give to those who enter into it and possess it an increasing and finally a complete possession of the truth consciousness and all that it carries in it. It will bring with it the realization of the divine in self and the divine in nature. All that is sought by the God-seeker will be fulfilled in his spirit and in his life as he moves towards spiritual perfection. He will become aware of the transcendent reality, possess in the self-experience the supreme existence, consciousness, bliss, be one with Satchidananda. He will become one with cosmic being and universal nature. He will contain the world in himself, in his own cosmic consciousness and feel himself one with all beings. He will see himself in all and all in himself, become united and identified with the self which has become all existences. He will perceive the beauty of the all-beautiful and the miracle of the all-wonderful. He will enter in the end into the bliss of the Brahman and live abidingly in it, and for all this he will not need to shun existence or plunge into the annihilation of the spiritual person in some self-extinguishing nirvana. As in the self, so in nature, he can realize the divine. The nature of the divine is light and power and bliss. He can feel the divine light and power and bliss above him and descending into him, filling every strand of his nature, every cell and atom of his being, flooding his soul and mind and life and body, surrounding him like an illimitable sea and filling the world, suffusing all his feeling and sense and experience, making all his life truly and utterly divine. This and all else that the spiritual consciousness can bring to him the divine life will give him when it reaches its utmost completeness and perfection and the supramental truth consciousness is fulfilled in all himself. But even before that he can attain to something of it all, grow in it, live in it, once the supermind has descended upon him and has the direction of his existence. All relations with the divine will be his. The trinity of God knowledge, divine works and devotion to God will open within him and move towards an utter self-giving and surrender of his whole being and nature. He will live in God and with God, possess God, as it is said, even plunge in him forgetting all separate personality, but not losing it in self-extinction. The love of God and all the sweetness of love will remain his, the bliss of contact as well as the bliss of oneness and the bliss of difference in oneness. All the infinite ranges of experience of the infinite will be his and all the joy of the finite in the embrace of the infinite. The descent of the supermind will bring to one who receives it and is fulfilled in the truth consciousness all the possibilities of the divine life. It will take up not only the whole characteristic experience which we recognize already as constituting the spiritual life but also all which we now exclude from that category but which is capable of divinization, not excluding whatever of the earth nature and the earth life can be transformed by the touch of the supermind and taken up into the manifested life of the spirit. For a divine life on earth need not be a thing apart and exclusive having nothing to do with the common earthly existence. It will take up human being and human life, transform what can be transformed, spiritualize whatever can be spiritualized, cast its influence on the rest and effectuate either a radical or an uplifting change, bring about a deeper communion between the universal and the individual, invade the ideal with the spiritual truth of which it is a luminous shadow and help to uplift. into or towards a greater and higher existence. Mind it will uplift towards a diviner light of thought and will, life towards deeper and truer emotion and action, towards a larger power of itself, towards high aims and motives. Whatever cannot yet be raised into its own full truth of being, it will bring nearer to that fullness. Whatever is not ready even for that change, will still see the possibility open to it whenever its still incomplete evolution has made it ready for self-fulfillment. Even the body, if it can bear the touch of supermind, will become more aware of its own truth, for there is a body consciousness that has its own instinctive truth and power of right condition and action, even a kind of unexpressed occult knowledge in the constitution of its cells and tissues which may one day become conscious and contribute to the transformation of the physical being. An awakening must come in the earth nature and in the earth consciousness, which will be, if not the actual beginning, at least the effective preparation and the first steps of its evolution towards a new and diviner world order. This would be the fulfillment of the divine life which the descent of supermind and the working of the truth consciousness taking hold of the whole nature of the living being would bring about in all who could open themselves to its power or influence. Even its first immediate effect would be on all who are capable the possibility of entering into the truth consciousness and changing all the movements of the nature more and more into the movements of the supramental truth, truth of thought, truth of will, truth in the feelings, truth in the acts, true conditions of the whole being even to the body, eventually transformation, a divinizing change. For those who could so open themselves and remain open, there would be no limitation to this development and even no fundamental difficulty, for all difficulties would be dissolved by the pressure of the supramental light and power from above pouring itself into the mind and the life force and the body. But the result of the supramental descent need not be limited to those who could thus open themselves entirely, and it need not be limited to the supramental change. There could also be a minor or secondary transformation of the mental being within a freed and perfected scope of the mental nature. In place of the human mind as it now is, a mind limited, imperfect, open at every moment to all kinds of deviation from the truth or missing of the truth, all kinds of error and openness even to the persuasions of a complete falsehood and perversion of the nature, a mind blinded and pulled down towards inconscience and ignorance, hardly arriving at knowledge, an intellect prone to interpret the higher knowledge in abstractions and indirect figures, seizing and holding even the messages of the higher intuition with an uncertain and disputed grasp. There could emerge a true mind liberated and capable of the free and utmost perfection of itself and its instruments, a life governed by the free and illumined mind, a body responsive to the light and able to carry out all that the free mind and will could demand of it. This change might happen not only in the few, but extend and generalize itself in the race. This possibility, if fulfilled, would mean that the human dream of perfection, perfection of itself, of its purified and enlightened nature, of all its ways of action and living, would be no longer a dream but a truth that could be made real and humanity lifted out of the hold on it of inconscience and ignorance. The life of the mental being could be harmonized with the life of the supermind, which will then be the highest order above it and become even an extension and annex of the truth consciousness, a part and province of the divine life. It is obvious that if the supermind is there and an order of supramental being is established as the leading principle in earth nature, as mind is now the leading principle, but with a sureness, a complete government of the earthly existence, a capacity of transformation of all upon their level and within their natural boundaries of which the mind in its imperfection was not capable, an immense change of human life, even if it did not extend to transformation, would be inevitable. It remains to consider what might be the obstacles in the way of this possibility, especially those offered by the nature of the earth order and its function as a field of a graded evolution in which our humanity is a stage and, it might be argued, its very imperfection and evolutionary necessity. How far could or would supermind by its presence and government of things overcome this difficulty while respecting the principle of gradation, and whether it could not rectify the wrong and ignorant order imposed by the ignorance and inconscience and substitute for it a right gradation in which the perfection and divinization would be possible? Certainly, the way for the individual would be open, whatever group of human beings aspire as united in an endeavor at a perfect and individual collective living, or aspire to the divine life, would be assisted towards the attainment of its aspiration, that at least the supermind would make its minimum consequence. But the greater possibility is also there and might even be offered to the whole of humanity. This, then, we have to consider: what would the descent of the supermind mean for mankind, and what would be its result or its promise for the whole life and evolutionary future and destiny of the human race? Supermind and humanity. What then would be the consequence for humanity of the descent of supermind into our earthly existence, its consequence for this race born into a world of ignorance and inconscience but capable of an upward evolution of its consciousness and an ascent into the light and power and bliss of a spiritual being and spiritual nature? The descent into the earth life of so supreme a creative power as the supermind and its truth consciousness could not be merely a new feature or factor added to that life or put in its front, but without any other importance, or only a restricted importance, carrying with it no results profoundly affecting the rest of earth nature. Especially it could not fail to exercise an immense influence on mankind as a whole, even a radical change in the aspect and prospect of its existence here, even if this power had no other capital result on the material world in which it had come down to intervene. One cannot but conclude that the influence, the change made, would be far-reaching, even enormous. It would not only establish the supermind and a supramental race of beings upon the earth, it could bring about an uplifting and transforming change in mind itself, and as an inevitable consequence in the consciousness of man, the mental being, and would equally bring about a radical and transforming change in the principles and forms of his living, his ways of action, and the whole build and tenor of his life. It would certainly open to man the access to the supramental consciousness and the supramental life, for we must suppose that it is by such a transformation that a race of supramental beings would be created, even as the human race itself has arisen by a less radical but still a considerable uplifting and enlargement of consciousness and conversion of the body's instrumentation and its indwelling and evolving mental and spiritual capacities and powers out of a first animal state. But even without any such complete transformation, the truth principle might so far replace the principle we see here of an original ignorance seeking for knowledge and arriving only at a partial knowledge, that the human mind could become a power of light, of knowledge finding itself, not the denizen of a halfway twilight or a servant and helper of the ignorance, a purveyor of mingled truth and error. Mind might even become in man, what it is in its fundamental origin, a subordinate, limited and special action of the supermind, a sufficiently luminous receptacle of truth, and at least all falsity in its works might cease. It could at once be objected that this would alter the whole evolutionary order and its balance and leave an incurable gap in its completeness. There would be an unbridged gulf between man and the animal, and no way for the evolutionary nisus to a journey over it in the progress of the consciousness from animality to divinity, for some kind of divinity would be involved in the suggested metamorphosis. It might be contended that the true process of evolution is to add a new principle, degree or stage to the already existing order, and not to make any alteration in any previously established feature. Man came into being, but the animal remained the animal and made no progress towards the half-humanity. All slight modifications of consciousness, capacities or habits in domestic animals produced by the association with man or by his training of them are only slight alterations of the animal intelligence. Still less can the plants move towards animal consciousness or brute matter become in the slightest degree, even subconsciously or half-subconsciously, aware of itself or responsive or reactive. The fundamental distinctions remain and must remain unaltered in the cosmic order. But this objection presumes that the new humanity must be all of one level. There may well be gradations of consciousness in it which would bridge the distance between its least developed elements and the higher animals who, although they cannot pass into a semi-human kind, might still progress towards a higher animal intelligence, for certain experiments show that these are not at all entirely unprogressive. These gradations would serve the purpose of the transition quite as well as the least developed humans in the present scale, without leaving a gap so wide as to disturb the evolutionary order of the universe. A considerable saltus can, as it is, be observed separating the different orders, matter and the plant and the lower animals, one species of animals and another, as well as that always existing and large enough between the highest animal and man. There would therefore be no incurable breach in the evolutionary order, no such distance between human mind and animal mind, between the new type of human being and the old animal level as could not be overleaped or would create an unbridgeable gulf for the most developed animal soul in its passage to the least developed type of the new humanity. A leap, a saltus, there would be, as there is now, but it would not be between animality and divinity, from animal mind to supermind. It would be between a most highly developed animal mind turning towards human possibilities, for without that the passage from animal to man could not be achieved, and a human mind waking to the possibility, not yet the full achievement, of its own higher yet unattained capacities. One result of the intervention of supermind in the earth nature, the descent of the supreme creative truth power, might well be a change in the law of evolution, its method and its arrangement. A larger element of the principle of evolution through knowledge might enter into the forces of the material universe. This might extend itself from a first beginning in the new creation and produce increasing effects in the order which is now wholly an evolution in the ignorance and indeed starts from the complete nescience of the inconscient and proceeds towards what can be regarded even in its highest attainment of knowledge as a lesser ignorance, since it is more a representation than a direct and complete possession of knowledge. If man began to develop the powers and means of a higher knowledge in something like fullness, if the developing animal opened the door of his mentality to beginnings of conscious thought and even a rudimentary reason, at his highest he is not so irrevocably far from that even now. If the plant developed its first subconscious reactions and attained to some kind of primary nervous sensitivity, if matter which is a blind form of the spirit were to become more alive with the hidden power within it and to offer more readily the secret sense of things, the occult realities it covers, as for instance, the record of the past it always preserves even in its dumb inconscience or the working of its involved forces and invisible movements revealing veiled powers in material nature to a subtler generalized perception of the new human intelligence, this would be an immense change promising greater changes in the future, but it would mean only an uplifting and not a disturbance of the universal order. Evolution would itself evolve, but it would not be perturbed or founder. It is difficult for us to conceive in theory or admit as a practical possibility the transformation of the human mentality I have suggested as a change that would naturally take place under the lead of the supramental truth consciousness, because our notions about mind are rooted in an experience of human mentality in a world which starts from inconscience and proceeds through a first almost complete nescience and a slowly lessening ignorance towards a high degree but always incomplete scope. An imperfect method of only partially equipped knowledge which does not serve fully the needs of a consciousness always pushing towards its own still immeasurably distant absolute. The visible imperfections and limitations of mind in the present stage of its evolution here we take as part of its very nature, but in fact the boundaries in which it is still penned are only temporary limits and measures of its still incomplete evolutionary advance. Its defects of methods and means are faults of its immaturity and not proper to the constitution of its being. Its achievement, although extraordinary under the hampering conditions of the mental being weighed down by its instrumentation in an earthly body, is far below and not beyond what will be possible to it in its illumined future. For mind is not in its very nature an inventor of errors, a father of lies bound down to a capacity of falsehood, wedded to its own mistakes and the leader of a stumbling life as it too largely is at present owing to our human shortcomings. It is in its origin a principle of light, an instrument put forth from the supermind and, though set to work within limits and even set to create limits, yet the limits are luminous borders for a special working, voluntary and purposive bounds, a service of the finite ever extending itself under the eye of infinity. It is this character of mind that will reveal itself under the touch of supermind and make human mentality an adjunct and a minor instrumentation of the supramental knowledge. It will even be possible for the mind no longer limited by the intellect to become capable of a sort of mental gnosis, a luminous reproduction of the truth in a diminished working extending the power of the light not only to its own but to lower levels of consciousness in their climb towards self-transcendence. Overmind, intuition, illumined mind and what I have called higher mind, these and other levels of a spiritualized and liberated mentality, will be able to reflect in the uplifted human mind and its purified and exalted feeling and force of life and action something of their powers and prepare the ascent of the soul to their own plateaus and peaks of an ascending existence. This is essentially the change which can be contemplated as a result of the new evolutionary order, and it would mean a considerable extension of the evolutionary field itself and will answer the question as to the result on humanity of the advent of supermind into the earth nature. If mind in its origin from supermind is itself a power of supermind, a principle of light and a power of light or a force for knowledge specialized in its action for a subordinate purpose, yet it assumes a different aspect when in the working out of this purpose it separates itself more and more from the supramental light, from the immediate power and supporting illumination of the supramental principle. It is as it departs more and more in this direction from its own highest truth that it becomes a creator or parent of ignorance and is or seems to be the highest power in a world of ignorance. It becomes itself subject to ignorance and seems only to arrive at a partial and imperfect knowledge. The reason of this decline is that it is used by the supermind principally for the work of differentiation which is necessary if there is to be a creation and a universe. In the supermind itself, in all its creation there is this differentiating power, the manifestation of the one in the many and the many in the one, but the one is never forgotten or lost in its multiplicity which always consciously depends upon and never takes precedence over the eternal oneness. In the mind, on the contrary, the differentiation, the multiplicity does take precedence and the conscious sense of the universal oneness is lost and the separated unit seems to exist for itself and by itself as a sufficient self-conscious integer or in inanimate objects as the inconscient integer. It should be noted, however, that a world or plane of mind need not be a reign of ignorance where falsity, error or nescience must have a place. It may be only a voluntary self-limitation of knowledge. It could be a world where all possibilities capable of being determined by mind could manifest themselves in the successions of time and find a true form and field of their action, the expressive figure of themselves, their capacity of self-development, self-realization of a kind, self-discovery. This is actually what we meet when we follow in psychic experience the line of descent by which the involution takes place which ends in matter and the creation of the material universe. What we see here is not the planes or worlds of the descent in which mind and life can keep something of their truth and something of the light of the spirit, something of their true and real being. Here we see an original inconscience and a struggle of life and mind and spirit to evolve out of the material inconscience and in a resultant ignorance to find themselves and grow towards their full capacity and highest existence. If mind succeeds in that endeavor, there is no reason why it should not recover its true character and be once more a principle and power of light and even in its own way aid in the workings of a true and complete knowledge. At its highest it might pass out of its limitations into the supramental truth and become part and function of the supramental knowledge, or at the least serve for a minor work of differentiation in the consensus of that knowledge. In the lower degree below supermind it might be a mental gnosis, a spiritual or spiritualized perception, feeling, activity, sense which could do the works of knowledge and not of ignorance. Even at a still lower level it could be an increasingly luminous passage leading from light to light, from truth to truth and no longer a circling in the mazes of half-truth and half-nescience. This would not be possible in a world where untransformed mind or human mind burdened with its hampering disabilities, as it now is, will still be the leader or the evolution's highest achievement, but with supermind for the leading and dominant power this might well happen, and might even be regarded as one result and an almost inevitable result of its descent into the human world and its touch on the mind of humanity. How far this would go, whether the whole of humanity would be touched or only a part of it ready for the change, would depend on what was intended or possible in the continued order of the universe. If the old evolutionary principle and order must be preserved, then only a section of the race would pass onward, the rest would keep the old human position, level and function in the ascending order. But even so there must be a passage or bridge between the two levels or orders of being by which the evolution would make its transition from one to the other. The mind would there be capable of contact with and modification by the supramental truth and thus would be the means of the soul's passing on upward. There must be a status of mind capable of receiving and growing in the light towards supermind though not reaching it, through that, as even now happens in a lesser degree through a dimmer Medium, the luster of a greater truth would send down its rays for the liberation and uplift of the soul in the ignorance. Supermind is here veiled behind a curtain and, though not organized for its own characteristic action, it is the true cause of all creation here, the power for the growth of truth and knowledge and the ascension of the soul towards the hidden reality. But in a world where supermind has made its appearance, it could hardly be a separate factor isolated from the rest. It would inevitably not only create Superman but change and uplift man. A total change of the mental principle, such as has been suggested, cannot be ruled out as impossible. Mind, as we know it, has a power of consciousness quite distinct from supermind, no longer a power devolved from it, connected with it and dependent upon it, but practically divorced from its luminous origin, is marked by several characteristics which we conceive to be the very signs of its nature. But some of these belong to supermind also, and the difference is in the way and scope of their action, not in their stuff or in their principle. The difference is that mind is not a power of whole knowledge, and only when it begins to pass beyond itself, a power of direct knowledge, it receives rays of the truth but does not live in the sun. It sees as through glasses and its knowledge is colored by its instruments. It cannot see with the naked eye or look straight at the sun. It is not possible for mind to take its stand in the solar center or anywhere in the radiant body or even on the shining circumference of the orb of perfect truth and acquire or share in its privilege of infallible or absolute knowledge. It would be only if it had already drawn near to the light of supermind that it could live anywhere near this sun in the full splendor of its rays, in something of the full and direct blaze of truth, and the human mind even at its highest is far from that. It can only live at most in a limited circle, in some narrow beginnings of a pure insight, a direct vision, and it would take long for it, even in surpassing itself, to reach to an imitative and fragmentary reflection of a dream of the limited omniscience and omnipotence which is the privilege of a delegated divinity, of the God, of a demiurge. It is a power for creation, but either tentative and uncertain and succeeding by good chance or the favor of circumstance, or else, if assured by some force of practical ability or genius, subject to flaw or pent within unescapable limits. Its highest knowledge is often abstract, lacking in a concrete grasp. It has to use expedients and unsure means of arrival, to rely upon reasoning, argumentation and debate, inferences, divinations, set methods of inductive or deductive logic, succeeding only if it is given correct and complete data, and even then liable to reach on the same data different results and varying consequences. It has to use means and accept results of a method which is hazardous even when making a claim to certitude, and of which there would be no need if it had a direct or a superintellectual knowledge. It is not necessary to push the description further. All this is the very nature of our terrestrial ignorance, and its shadow hangs on even to the thought and vision of the sage and the seer, and can be escaped only if the principle of a truth-conscious supramental knowledge descends and takes up the governance of the earth nature. It should be noted, however, that even at the bottom of the involutionary descent, in the blind eclipse of consciousness in matter, in the very field of the working of the inconscient, there are signs of the labor of an infallible force, the drive of a secret consciousness and its promptings, as if the inconscient itself were secretly informed or impelled by a power with a direct and absolute knowledge. Its acts of creation are infinitely surer than the workings of our human consciousness at its best, or the normal workings of the life power. Matter, or rather the energy in matter, seems to have a more certain knowledge, a more infallible operation of its own, and its mechanism once set going can be trusted for the most part to do its work accurately and well. It is so that man is able, taking hold of a material energy, to mechanize it for his own ends and trust it under proper conditions to do for him his work. The self-creating life power, amazingly abundant in its invention and fantasy, yet seems to be more capable of flaw, aberration and failure. It is as if its greater consciousness carried in it a greater capacity for error. Yet it is sure enough ordinarily in its workings, but as consciousness increases in the forms and operations of life, and most when mind enters in, disturbances also increase, as if the increase of consciousness brought with it not only richer possibilities but more possibilities of stumbling, error, flaw and failure. In mind, in man, we seem to reach the height of this antinomy, the greatest, highest, widest reach and achievements of consciousness, the greatest amount of uncertainty, defect, failure and error. This, we may conjecture, may be because in inconscient nature there is a truth of energy at work which follows infallibly its own law, an energy which can walk blindfold without stumbling because the automatic law of the truth is within it, operating surely without swerving or mistake when there is no external intervention or interference. But in all normally automatic processes of existence there is this law. Even the body has an unexpressed knowledge of its own, a just instinct in its action within certain limits, and this, when not interfered with by life's desires and mind's errors, can work with a certain accuracy and sureness. But supermind alone has the truth consciousness in full, and, if this comes down and intervenes, mind, life and body too can attain to the full power of the truth in them and their full possibility of perfection. This, no doubt, would not take place at once, but an evolutionary progress towards it could begin and grow with increasing rapidity towards its fullness. All men might not reach that fullness till a later time, but still the human mind could come to stand perfected in the light and a new humanity take its place as part of the new order. This is the possibility we have to examine. If it is destined to fulfill itself, if man is not doomed to remain always as a vassal of the ignorance, the disabilities of the human mind on which we have dwelt are not such as must remain irredeemably in possession and binding forever. It could develop higher means and instrumentalities, pass over the last borders of the ignorance into a higher knowledge, grow too strong to be held back by the animal nature. There would be a liberated mind escaping from ignorance into light, aware of its affiliation to supermind, a natural agent of supermind and capable of bringing down the supramental influence into the lower reaches of being, a creator in the light, a discoverer in the depths, an illuminant in the darkness, helping perhaps to penetrate even the inconscient with the rays of a secret superconscience. There would be a new mental being not only capable of standing enlightened in the radiance of the supermind but able to climb consciously towards it and into it, training life and body to reflect and hold something of the supramental light, power and bliss, aspiring to release the secret divinity into self-finding and self-fulfillment and self-poise, aspiring towards the ascension to the divine consciousness, able to receive and bear the descent of the divine light and power, fitting itself to be a vessel of the divine life. Supermind in the evolution. A new humanity would then be a race of mental beings on the earth and in the earthly body, but delivered from its present conditions in the reign of the cosmic ignorance so far as to be possessed of a perfected mind. A mind of light which could even be a subordinate action of the supermind or truth consciousness, and in any case capable of the full possibilities of mind acting as a recipient of that truth and at least a secondary action of it in thought and life. It could even be a part of what could be described as a divine life upon earth, and at least the beginnings of an evolution in the knowledge and no longer entirely or predominantly in the ignorance. How far this would go, whether it would eventually embrace the whole of humanity or only an advanced portion of it, would depend upon the intention in the evolution itself, on the intention in whatever cosmic or transcendent will is guiding the movements of the universe. We have supposed not only the descent of the supermind upon the earth but its embodiment in a supramental race with all its natural consequences and a new total action in which the new humanity would find its complete development and its assured place in the new order. But it is clear that all this could only come as a result of the evolution which is already taking place upon Earth, extending far beyond its present bounds and passing into a radically new movement governed by a new principle in which mind and man would be subordinate elements and no longer mind the utmost achievement or man the head or leader. The evolution we see around us at present is not of that kind and, it might be said, shows few signs of such a possibility, so few that the reason, at present our only sure guide, has no right to hazard belief in it. Earth, the earth we see, with its life deeply immersed and founded in inconscience and ignorance, is not built for such a development or capable of holding such an advent. Its materiality and limitations condemn it to be permanently the field of a far inferior order. It may be said too that for such an order there must be a place somewhere, and even if supermind is not a mere unwarranted speculation and is a concrete reality, there is no need and no place for its embodying itself here. Mind as marking the full play of the knowledge possible to the ignorance must have its field somewhere, and to keep the earth as its natural field would best serve the economy of cosmic nature. A materialistic philosophy would admit of no possibility of a divine life in matter, but even a philosophy admitting a soul or spirit or a spiritual terminus of the evolutionary movement here could very well deny the capacity of Earth for a divine life. A divine existence could only be achieved by a departure from Earth and the body. Even if cosmic existence is not an illusion or maya, a divine or a completely spiritual being is likely to be possible only in another less material world or only in the pure spirit. At any rate, to the normal human reason the odds seem to be heavily against any early materialization on Earth of anything divine. Again, if too strong a stress is laid on the present or apparent character of the evolution here as it is presented to us by physical science, it might be urged that there is no warrant for expecting any emergence of a principle higher than human mind or of any such thing as superhuman beings in a world of matter. Consciousness is itself dependent upon matter and material agencies for its birth and its operations, and an infallible truth consciousness, such as we suppose supermind to be, would be a contradiction of these conditions and must be dismissed as a chimera. Fundamentally, physical science regards evolution as a development of forms and vital activities. The development of a larger and more capable consciousness is a subordinate result of the development of life and form and not a major or essential characteristic or circumstance, and it cannot go beyond limits determined by the material origin of mind and life. Mind has shown itself capable of many extraordinary achievements, but independence of the material organ or of physical conditions or a capability for any such thing as a power of direct and absolute knowledge not acquired by material means would be beyond the conditions imposed by nature. At a certain point, therefore, the evolution of consciousness can go no further. Even if a something definite and independent which we call a soul exists, it is limited by its natural conditions here, where matter is the basis, physical life the condition, mind the highest possible instrument. There is no possibility of an action of consciousness apart from the body or surpassing this physical, vital or mental nature. This fixes the limits of our evolution here. It might be suggested also that until something clearly recognizable like supermind manifests itself with some definiteness and fullness, or until it descends and takes possession of our earth consciousness, we cannot be certain that it exists. Till then, mind holds the place as a general arbiter or field of reference for all knowledge, and mind is incapable of any certain or absolute knowledge. It has to doubt all, to test all, and yet to achieve all, but cannot be secure in its knowledge or its achievement. That, incidentally, establishes the necessity of such a principle as the supermind or truth consciousness in any intelligible universe, for without it there is no issue, no goal for either life or knowledge. Consciousness cannot achieve its own entire meaning, its own supreme result without it. It will end in an inconsequence or a fiasco. To become aware of its own truth and all truth is the very aim of its existence, and it cannot do so long as it has to tend towards truth, towards knowledge in ignorance, and through the ignorance, it must develop or it must reach a power of itself whose very nature is to know, to see, to possess in its own power. This is what we call supermind, and, once it is admitted, all the rest becomes intelligible. But till then we are in doubt, and it may be contended that even if supermind is admitted as a reality, there can be no certainty of its advent and reign. Till then all effort towards it may end in failure. It is not enough that the supermind should be actually there above us, its descent a possibility or a future intention in nature. We have no certainty of the reality of this descent until it becomes an objectivized fact in our earthly being. Light has often tried to descend upon the earth, but the light remains unfulfilled and incomplete. Man may reject the light, the world is still full of darkness, and the advent seems to be little more than a chance. This doubt is to some extent justified by the actualities of the past and still existing possibilities of the future. Its power to stand would disappear only if supermind is once admitted as a consequent part of the order of the universe. If the evolution tends from matter to supermind, it must also tend to bring down supermind into matter, and the consequences are inevitable. The whole trouble of this incertitude arises from the fact that we do not look straight at the whole truth of the world as it is and draw from it the right conclusion as to what the world must be and cannot fail to be. This world is, no doubt, based ostensibly upon matter, but its summit is spirit, and the ascent towards spirit must be the aim and justification of its existence and the pointer to its meaning and purpose. But the natural conclusion to be drawn from the supremacy and summit existence of spirit is clouded by a false or imperfect idea of spirituality which has been constructed by intellect in its ignorance and even by its too hasty and one-sided grasp at knowledge. The spirit has been thought of not as something all-pervading and the secret essence of our being, but as something only looking down on us from the heights and drawing us only towards the heights and away from the rest of existence. So we get the idea of our cosmic and individual being as a great illusion, and departure from it an extinction in our consciousness of both individual and cosmos as the only hope, the sole release. Or we build up the idea of the earth as a world of ignorance, suffering and trial and our only future an escape into heavens beyond. There is no divine prospect for us here, no fulfillment possible even with the utmost evolution on earth in the body, no victorious transformation, no supreme object to be worked out in terrestrial existence. But if supermind exists, if it descends, if it becomes the ruling principle, all that seems impossible to mind becomes not only possible but inevitable. If we look closely, we shall see that there is a straining of mind and life on their heights toward their own perfection, towards some divine fulfillment, towards their own absolute. That and not only something beyond and elsewhere is the true sign, the meaning of this constant evolution and the labor of continual birth and rebirth and the spiral ascent of nature. But it is only by the descent of supermind and the fulfillment of mind and life by their self-exceeding that this secret intention in things, this hidden meaning of spirit and nature can become utterly overt and in its totality realizable. This is the evolutionary aspect and significance of supermind, but in truth it is an eternal principle existing covertly even in the material universe, the secret supporter of all creation. It is that which makes the emergence of consciousness possible and certain in an apparently inconscient world and compels a climb in nature towards a supreme spiritual reality. It is, in fact, an already and always existent plane of being, the nexus of spirit and matter, holding in its truth and reality and making certain the whole meaning and aim of the universe. If we disregard our present ideas of evolution, all changes, if we can regard consciousness and not life and form as the fundamental and essential evolutionary principle and its emergence and full development of its possibilities as the object of the evolutionary urge, the inconscience of matter cannot be an insuperable obstacle, for in this inconscience can be detected an involved consciousness which has to evolve. Life and mind are steps and instruments of that evolution. The purposeful drive and workings of the inconscient material energy are precisely such as we can attribute to the presence of an involved consciousness automatic, not using thought like the mind but guided by something like an inherent material instinct practically infallible in all its steps, not yet cognitive but miraculously creative. The entirely and inherently enlightened truth consciousness we attribute to supermind would be the same reality appearing at an ultimate stage of the evolution, finally evolved and no longer wholly involved as in matter or partly and imperfectly evolved and therefore capable of imperfection and error as in life and mind, now possessed of its own natural fullness and perfection, luminously automatic, infallible. All the objections to a complete evolutionary possibility then fall away. It would, on the contrary, be the inevitable consequence contained not only in nature as a whole but even in material nature. In this vision of things the universe will reveal itself in its unity and totality as a manifestation of a single being, nature as its power of manifestation, evolution as its process of gradual self-revelation here in matter. We would see the divine series of the worlds as a ladder of ascent from matter to supreme spirit. There would reveal itself the possibility, the prospect of a supreme manifestation by the conscious and no longer a veiled and enigmatic descent of the spirit and its powers in their fullness even into this lowest world of matter. The riddle of the universe need be no longer a riddle, the dubious mystery of things would put off its enigma, its constant ambiguity, the tangled writings would become legible and intelligible. In this revelation, supermind would take its natural place and no longer be a matter of doubt or questioning to an intelligence bewildered by the complexity of the world. It would appear as the inevitable consequence of the nature of mind, life and matter, the fulfillment of their meaning, their inherent principle and tendencies, the necessary perfection of their imperfection, the summit to which all are climbing, the consummation of divine existence, consciousness and bliss to which it is leading, the last result of the birth of things and supreme goal of this progressive manifestation which we see here in life. The full emergence of supermind may be accomplished by a sovereign manifestation, a descent into earth consciousness and a rapid assumption of its powers and disclosing of its forms and the creation of a supramental race and a supramental life. This must indeed be the full result of its action in nature. But this has not been the habit of evolutionary nature in the past upon Earth, and it may well be that this supramental evolution also will fix its own periods, though it cannot be at all a similar development to that of which Earth has hitherto been the witness. But once it has begun, all must unavoidably and perfectly manifest, and all parts of nature must tend towards a greatest possible luminousness and perfection. It is this certainty that authorizes us to believe that mind and humanity also will tend towards the realization that will be far beyond our present dreams of perfection. A mind of light will replace the present confusion and trouble of this earthly ignorance. It is likely that even those parts of humanity which cannot reach it will yet be aware of its possibility and consciously tend towards it. Not only so, but the life of humanity will be enlightened, uplifted, governed, harmonized by this luminous principle, and even the body becomes something much less powerless, obscure and animal in its propensities, and capable instead of a new and harmonized perfection. It is this possibility that we have to look at, and that would mean a new humanity uplifted into light, capable of a spiritualized being and action, open to governance by some light of the truth consciousness, capable even on the mental level and in its own order of something that might be called the beginning of a divinized life. Mind of light. A new humanity means for us the appearance, the development of a type or race of mental beings whose principle of mentality would be no longer a mind in the ignorant seeking for knowledge, but even in its knowledge bound to the ignorance, a seeker after light but not its natural possessor, open to the light but not an inhabitant of the light, not yet a perfected instrument, truth conscious and delivered out of the ignorance. Instead, it would be possessed already of what could be called a mind of light, a mind capable of living in the truth, capable of being truth conscious and manifesting in its life a direct in place of an indirect knowledge. Its mentality would be an instrument of the light and no longer of the ignorance. At its highest it would be capable of passing into the supermind, and from the new race would be recruited the race of supramental beings who would appear as the leaders of the evolution in earth nature. Even the highest manifestations of a mind of light would be an instrumentality of the supermind, a part of it or a projection from it, a stepping beyond humanity into the superhumanity of the supramental principle. Above all, its possession would enable the human being to rise beyond the normalities of his present thinking, feeling and being into those highest powers of the mind in its self-exceedings which intervene between our mentality and supermind and can be regarded as steps leading towards the greater and more luminous principle. This advance, like others in the evolution, might not be reached and would naturally not be reached at one bound, but from the very beginning it would be inevitable. The pressure of the supermind creating from above out of itself the mind of light would compel this certainty of the eventual outcome. The first gleamings of the new light would carry in themselves the seed of its highest flamings. Even in the first beginnings, the certainty of their topmost powers would be there, for this is the constant story of each evolutionary emergence. The principle of its highest perfection lies concealed in the involution which precedes and necessitates the evolution of the secret principle. For throughout the story of evolution there are two complementary aspects which constitute its action and are necessary to its totality. There is hidden in the involution of nature the secret power and principle of being which lies concealed under the veil cast on it by material nature, and there is carried in that nature itself the inevitable force of the principle compelling the process of emergence of its inherent powers and characters, the essential features which constitute its reality. As the evolutionary principle emerges, there are also two constant features of the process of the emergence. There are the gradations by which it climbs out of the involution and manifests more and more of its power, its possibilities, the force of the Godhead within it, and there is a constant manifestation of all types and forms of its being which are the visible, indicative and efficient embodiments of its essential nature. There appear in the evolutionary process organized forms and activities of matter, the types of life and the living beings, the types of mind and the thinking beings, the luminosities and greatnesses of the spiritual principle and the spiritual beings whose nature, character, personality, mark the stages of the ascent towards the highest heights of the evolution and the ultimate largest manifestation of what it is in itself and must become by the force of time and the all-revealing spirit. This is the real sense and drive of what we see as evolution. The multiplication and variation of forms is only the means of its process. Each gradation contains the possibility and the certainty of the grades beyond it. The emergence of more and more developed forms and powers point to more perfected forms and greater powers beyond them, and each emergence of consciousness and the conscious beings proper to it enables the rise to a greater consciousness beyond and the greater order of beings up to the ultimate Godheads of which nature is striving and is destined to show herself capable. Matter developed its organized forms until it became capable of embodying living organisms. Then life rose from the subconscious of the plant into conscious animal formations and through them to the thinking life of man. Mind founded in life developed intellect, developed its types of knowledge and ignorance, truth and error till it reached the spiritual perception and illumination, and now can see as in a glass dimly the possibility of supermind and a truth-conscious existence. In this inevitable ascent the mind of light is a gradation, an inevitable stage. As an evolving principle it will mark a stage in the human ascent and evolve a new type of human being. This development must carry in it an ascending gradation of its own powers and types of an ascending humanity which will embody more and more the turn towards spirituality, capacity for light, a climb towards a divinized manhood and the divine life. In the birth of the mind of light and its ascension into its own recognizable self and its true status and right province there must be, in the very nature of things as they are and very nature of the evolutionary process as it is at present, two stages. In the first, we can see the mind of light gathering itself out of the ignorance, assembling its constituent elements, building up its shapes and types however imperfect at first and pushing them towards perfection till it can cross the border of the ignorance and appear in the light, in its own light. In the second stage we can see it developing itself in that greater natural light, taking its higher shapes and forms till it joins the supermind and lives as its subordinate portion or its delegate. In each of these stages it will define its own grades and manifest the order of its beings who will embody it and give to it a realized life. Thus there will be built up, first, even in the ignorance itself, the possibility of a human ascent towards a divine living. Then there will be, by the illumination of this mind of light in the greater realization of what may be called a Gnostic mentality, in a transformation of the human being, even before the supermind is reached, even in the earth consciousness and in a humanity transformed, an illumined divine life. Supermind and mind of light. The essential character of supermind is a truth consciousness which knows by its own inherent right of nature, by its own light, it has not to arrive at knowledge but possesses it. It may indeed, especially in its evolutionary action, keep knowledge behind its apparent consciousness and bring it forward as if from behind the veil, but even then this veil is only an appearance and does not really exist. The knowledge was always there, the consciousness its possessor and present revealer. This too is only in the evolutionary play, and on the supramental plane itself the consciousness lives always in an immediacy of knowledge and acts by a direct immediacy of knowledge. In mind as we see it here the action is very different. It starts from an apparent absence of knowledge, a seeming ignorance or nescience, even, in material nature, from an inconscience in which any kind of knowing does not seem at all to exist. It reaches knowledge or the action of knowledge by steps which are not at all immediate, but rather knowledge at first seems utterly impossible and foreign to the very substance of this matter. Yet, in the blindness of matter itself there are signs of a concealed consciousness which in its hidden fundamental being sees and has the power to act according to its vision, and even by an infallible immediacy which is inherent in its nature. This is the same truth that is apparent in supermind but is here involved and seems not to be. The mind of light is a subordinate action of supermind, dependent upon it even when not apparently springing direct from it. in which the secret of this connection becomes evident and palpable. The truth consciousness is not only a power of knowledge, it is a being of consciousness and knowledge, a luminous many-sided dynamis and play of the omniscient spirit. In it there can be a spiritual feeling, a spiritual sensation, a spiritual essentiality of substance that knows and reveals, that acts and manifests in an omniscience which is one with omnipotence. In mind, this truth consciousness and these workings of the truth consciousness can be there, and even though it limits itself in mind and has a subordinate or an indirect working, its action can be essentially the same. There can even be a hidden immediacy which hints at the presence of something absolute and is evidence of the same omnipotence and omniscience. In the mind of light, when it becomes full-orbed, this character of the truth reveals itself, though in a garb that is transparent even when it seems to cover. For this too is a truth consciousness and a self-power of knowledge. This too proceeds from the supermind and depends upon it even though it is limited and subordinate. What we have called specifically the mind of light is indeed the last of a series of descending planes of consciousness in which the supermind veils itself by a self-chosen limitation or modification of its self-manifesting activities, but its essential character remains the same. There is in it an action of light, of truth, of knowledge in which inconscience, ignorance and error claim no place. It proceeds from knowledge to knowledge. We have not yet crossed over the borders of the truth conscious into ignorance. The methods also are those of a self-luminous knowing and seeing and feeling and a self-fulfilling action within its own borders. There is no need to seek for something missing, no fumbling, no hesitation. All is still a Gnostic action of a Gnostic power and principle. There has been a descent from full supermind into mind, but this mind, though a self-limited, is not yet an agnostic consciousness unsure of itself or unsure of its workings. There is still a comprehending or an apprehending consciousness which goes straight to its object and does not miss its mark or have to hunt for it in the dark or in insufficient light. It sees, knows, puts its hand immediately on things of self and things of nature. We have passed into mind, but mind has still not broken its inherent connection with the supramental principle. Still there is an increasing self-limitation which begins even with overmind. Overmind is separated by only a luminous border on the full light and power of the supramental truth, and it still commands direct access to all that supermind can give it. There is a further limitation or change of characteristic action at each step downwards from overmind to intuition, from intuition to illumined mind, from illumined mind to what I have called the higher mind. The mind of light is a transitional passage by which we can pass from supermind and superhumanity to an illumined humanity. For the new humanity will be capable of at least a partly divinized way of seeing and living, because it will live in the light and in knowledge and not in the obscuration of the ignorance. Still, again, there will be a difference between the superhuman and the human, a difference in nature and power, but a difference especially in the access and way of admission to the truth consciousness and its activities. There may indeed be two orders of its truth, direct and half-direct, immediate and near, or even only a reception at a distance. But this we must consider afterwards. At present it is sufficient to mark certain differences in the descending order of Gnostic mind which culminates here. We may say that there is a higher hemisphere of our being in which mind, luminous and aware of its working, still lives in the light and can be seen as a subordinate power of the supermind. It is still an agent of the truth consciousness, a Gnostic power that has not descended into the mental ignorance. It is capable of a mental gnosis that preserves its connection with the superior light and acts by its power. This is the character of overmind in its own plane and of all the powers that are dependent on the overmind. The supermind works there but at one remove, as if in something that it has put forth from itself but which is no longer entirely itself but is still a delegate of the truth and invested with its authority. We are moving towards a transitional border beyond which lies the possibility of the ignorance, but the ignorance is not yet here. In the order of the evolutionary descent we stand in the mind of light on that border, and a step downward can carry us beyond it into the beginnings of an ignorance which still bears on its face something of the luminosity that it is leaving behind it. On the other hand, in the ascending order of the evolution we reach a transition in which we see the light, are turned towards it, reflected in our consciousness, and one further step carries us into the domain of the light. The truth becomes visible and audible to us, and we are in immediate communication with its messages and illuminations and can grow into it and be made one with its substance. Thus there is a succession of ranges of consciousness which we can speak of as mind, but which belongs practically to the higher hemisphere, although in their ontological station they are within the domain of the lower hemisphere. For the whole of being is a connected totality, and there is in it no abrupt passage from the principle of truth and light into their opposite. The creative truth of things works and can work infallibly even in the inconscient. The spirit is there in matter, and it has made a series of steps by which it can travel from it to its own heights in an uninterrupted line of gradations. The depths are linked to the heights, and the law of the one truth creates and works everywhere. Even in the material world, which seems to us a world of ignorance, a world of the workings of a blind and inconscient force, starting from inconscience and proceeding through ignorance and reaching with difficulty towards an imperfect light and knowledge, there is still a secret truth in things which arranges all, guides towards the self many contrary powers of being, and rises towards its own heights where it can manifest its own highest truth and fulfill the secret purpose of the universe. Even this material world of existence is built upon a pattern of the truth in things which we call law of nature, a truth from which we climb to a greater truth until we emerge in the light of the Supreme. This world is not really created by a blind force of nature. Even in the inconscient the presence of the Supreme Truth is at work. There is a seeing power behind it which acts infallibly, and the steps of the ignorance itself are guided even when they seem to stumble. For what we call the ignorance is a cloaked knowledge, a knowledge at work in a body not its own but moving towards its own supreme self-discovery. This knowledge is the covert supermind which is the support of the creation and is leading all towards itself, and guides behind this multitude of minds and creatures and objects which seem each to be following its own law of nature. In this vast and apparently confused mass of existence there is a law, a one truth of being, a guiding and fulfilling purpose of the world existence. The supermind is veiled here and does not work according to its characteristic law of being and self-knowledge, but without it nothing could reach its aim. A world governed by an ignorant mind would soon drift into a chaos. It could not in fact come into existence or remain in existence unless supported by the secret omniscience of which it is the cover. A world governed by a blind inconscient force might repeat constantly the same mechanical workings, but it would mean nothing and arrive nowhere. This could not be the cause of an evolution that creates life out of matter, out of life-mind, and a gradation of planes of matter, life and mind culminating in the emergence of supermind. The secret truth that emerges in supermind has been there all the time, but now it manifests itself and the truth in things and the meaning of our existence. It is in this series of the order of existence and as the last word of the lower hemisphere of being, the first word of the higher hemisphere, that we have to look at the mind of light and see what is its nature and the powers which characterize it and which it uses for its self-manifestation and workings, its connection with supermind and its consequences and possibilities for the life of a new humanity.